Hi there. I'm Dr. Susie Hudson. I'm the Clinical Director at NADA, and thanks for joining me for this webinar today. We're going to be focusing today on essential data collection. We're going to really focus in on the NADAbase client outcomes measures that you may be collecting right now with your clients and the people accessing your services. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting today. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land as part of the Eora Nation, as the traditional custodians of the land on which the NADA office stands. We extend this acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across Australia and pay our respects to elders past, present, and to future generations. This is the NADAbase team, myself and Tata de Jesus. She is a Senior Project Officer and probably been responding to a lot of your queries and questions. We're here for you. So if at any time you need some advice or support, please reach out. Today, the key learning objectives and the things we're going to cover is really to be able to identify and review the foundational skills in building good relationships with clients, applying skills in rapport building, active listening, and sort of finding that middle ground when talking to clients about sensitive topics in the collection of data. And most importantly, how to weave client outcomes measures into the therapy. For a long time, we've been perhaps collecting outcomes. In fact, NADAbase has now 10 years worth of data. And whilst it's been very useful for lots of people accessing treatment and for funders, we really feel like it's time to ensure we're weaving it back to for whom it sort of matters most, and that is the clients and the people who are accessing our services. It aligns really nicely with the NADA capability framework, particularly around foundational knowledge and practice, communication and engagement, access and equity, and specifically around treatment and interventions. As a bit of an overview, we'll explore the client outcome measures that are contained in NADAbase, their importance and their rationale for how they came to be included. We're going to look at some general guidelines for administering the client outcomes measures, or COMS, and we're going to have a close look at some of the surveys and their application to therapeutic work. So client measures, what are they? Sometimes we call them routine measurement or ROMs, and in this case, in NADAbase, we refer to them as COMS. But what they're really unique in doing is they are about assessing not only a client's current situation and their wellbeing, and that's really a part of that assessment, but it's those follow-up administration of the same surveys done at different time points that provide us with what is an outcome measure. It's that routine part of collecting the same outcome measures that then inform the treatment. The other really important part about client outcome measuring is that it's there to build on evidence-based practice. It's a measure of understanding how well the treatment that we're providing, the support, whether it's in a residential situation, whether it's in the community, whether it's specific counselling or a group program, whether it's actually supporting and assisting the client to reach the goals that they have set for themselves. It's so important that we really introduce outcomes measurement as part of the therapy, that we don't see it as a task that needs to be done because someone's asking us to, but that we see it as being woven in and informing the type of treatment we're providing to the individual we're serving. We know that the treatment that we provide is person-centered, and what that tells us is that we are checking in with the client at all times to see if it's working for them. Outcomes measures can really assist us to do this job by routinely and independently asking the same questions at different time points, and then looking at whether there's been change. There's been perhaps improvement, there's been no change, or whether things have got worse or deteriorated. And so it's important that we weave that into the practice, we explain it to the clients that we're serving, and then we follow that up. An outcomes measure is only truly an outcome measure if indeed there are at least 2 time points of data collection. And so for many of you, you would start the outcomes measuring at intake. So you would start that process. You would then be following it up perhaps at 30 days and then 60 days and so on and so forth, including at exit. And then hopefully, if at all possible, we can do some follow-up into the community. So when, to about 10 or so years ago, NADA embarked and was supported by the Ministry of Health to really think about expanding the data that was being collected. So you'll be familiar with the Alcohol and Other Drug Treatment Services national minimum data set and state or New South Wales minimum data sets. These were being collected and were spearheaded or prompted by the Drug Summit back in the 90s. But we knew that this descriptive data was not enough to really tell us about how the experience was going for the client and whether or not the treatment we were providing was providing the person with what they needed to address the goals they had set for themselves. And so what NADA did was to embark on a process of review. And we did that independently, and we got someone to explore. That man's name was Mark Deedy. And he, through the NDARC, the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, he went through and looked at all brief measures that were self-reported. So that is a measure that you're asking of the client, and the client's responses are the data itself, that they were free of any licensing issues. So we didn't need to be paying for them, so that we could provide them free to all the services that we represent. And that they could be administered, that is, that the person asking the questions could be from any educational or therapeutic background. So you didn't need to be a psychologist or a clinical psychologist. You could be an alcohol and other drug worker, social worker, what have you. And so it was through that review that there were several measures that were synthesized down. But what was always in agreement was the domains. And what that means is the specific areas that were being explored by these measures. So it was decided at that time that what was important to understand was someone's drug and alcohol health. And so as part of that process, and with consultation with members and with clients, the substance dependence survey was, the SDS, or severity dependence survey, was selected. And then there were items that looked specifically at the use and frequency of drugs of concern to the person. You'll notice too that if you do use other measures such as the ATOP or the Australian Treatment Outcome Profile, that they too look at those items very, very specifically, looking at that frequency of use and amount of use. In terms of psychological health, the K10 Plus was selected. And for those of you who are familiar with that, you would understand that that looks very specifically at symptoms of distress, falling into either areas of depression or anxiety. And then the plus is simply some more qualitative questions about the impact of the distress on routine activities such as work, or whether or not it had prompted someone to reach out for additional help. The other domain was health and social functioning. And for that, the quality of life, or the WHO Quality 8, was selected. And once again, this particular measure looking specifically at general health and wellbeing. And then there were some particular items selected from the BTOM, or the Brief Treatment Outcomes Measuring Tool, which have been used in Australia for a considerable period of time and is still often used in relation to people who are receiving pharmacotherapy. And the specific questions that were selected from that looked specifically at blood-borne virus exposure risk. And so once again, in combination, these different measures were seen to be addressing or attending to some areas of life that people would usually be seeking to address by coming to drug and alcohol treatment. And so these items all together build up to be the NADAbase COMS suite of tools. And once again, And we certainly endeavoured to look at the other common tools that are used. You may in your service use variations on these domains. So you, instead of in terms of psychological health, you may use the DAS-21, for example, or in terms of drug and alcohol health, you may look at some of the other audit tools, for example. What is really useful though is to know is that across the country, in fact, these types of domains, irrespective of the types of surveys or instruments that are used, are routinely collected as part of outcomes measurement. We're going to turn now and hear from some of our service providers. So these are NADA members who've been using NADAbase COMS to tell you a little bit about what they find useful and what's included in terms of the measures.
Long-term journey with COMS, it actually gives us, if we did look at the results of one person, you can actually see the ebbs and flows of a person that have done the COMS. So for us, we're a 12-month program, and we try to do it every month or even less whenever, but for us, we do a minimum standard of 12 once a month, so that by the end of their time with us, they should have 12, and we can kind of track that, see, okay, look, and it just shows the client, oh, cool, it wasn't easy, but I got there. And it makes it more client-centered, client-focused, because it's them answering the questions, and we can work with them on, okay, you see this, what do you want to address? So.
COMS is really the one key place that is providing the information and the data that we need to demonstrate the outcomes that are being made and the changes that are being made. So that's where the really valuable information comes in terms of, client, no longer having the level of mental health distress, for example, or reducing their drug use, for example, or stabilising their housing, for example. So that can provide some really valuable information there that is being then entered onto a data system that then can get collected as a whole for the sector as a whole and for that service and for that client in particular.
We look at some of the COMS trends over time. So we look at it on a quarterly, 6-monthly, annual basis. So we can see from our graphs whether that we're improving or not. And so if we're not improving, then that's something we need to really look hard at and work out why. What are we doing that's not helping our clients? And that's when, as a management team, we have to make decisions as to what to change or where we're going wrong.
Let's turn now to general guidelines for administering COMS. The very most important thing to start with when talking with your clients about the collecting of any data, and indeed any interaction that you're having with them, is the importance of privacy and confidentiality. So we, providing services in New South Wales and across the country, are we sit under the National Privacy Act, and we all need to be adhering to that. And so as a worker at your service, you may have been asked initially to sign a form that helps you to understand what your roles and responsibilities are in relation to the gathering of client information, the importing into whatever database you may use, and then also the retrieval of that information. You're also having to adhere to the New South Wales Health Records and Information Privacy Act. And these acts and legislation are very clear about the collection of data, the storage of data, the reporting of data, and how that might be shared with other organisations. So if you haven't familiarised yourself with this legislation, we would recommend that you do so. Similarly, all organisations that report their data to us at NADA and into NADAbase, they themselves also, as an organisation, have signed an agreement so that they can acknowledge what NADA's role is in terms of data collection and how that might be used. And all the information and data that does come to NADA is completely de-identified. So it's really important that you're able to take your client through privacy and confidentiality, to reassure them about where their data goes, what it's used for, and how it might be shared with other organisations, or only with their involvement and their knowledge. So informed consent is really key in this process. You're making having a conversation or inviting a conversation with your client about why you're collecting this information. And that's particularly important when it comes to personal information and some of the questions that are contained as part of the COMS measures. So it's really about weaving that into the conversation. You know, we ask these questions of all the clients that come through our service. We ask them because it helps us to best tailor the treatment to your needs. And we will be revisiting these questions as you go through your treatment with us to really check in and see whether what we're doing with you, alongside you, is working for you. And if it's not, we've got an opportunity to shift and change and tweak it to really ensure that you're getting what you need in terms of your goals. You really want to be very clear about that legislation that I told you about, and really to inform them that they're entitled to access their own records. And they may do that with you as a clinician. And that's where we talk all the time about bringing the data collection into the therapy. And that is to say that where you're collecting outcomes measures, you're sharing that with your client. Clients in the depths of treatment may often feel like perhaps things aren't shifting or are not moving. And yet the outcomes measures may indeed tell a different story. And so sharing with them the results of outcomes measures at different time points can be really helpful. You really want to make sure that they understand where the data goes and how it's reported, that it's de-identified, and that if you're doing a particular project of some kind, that it may inform improvements, so that is quality improvements at the organisational level. If indeed research is happening and perhaps the data is being collected as part of that process, then you'll be aware that there's a whole process of ethics that needs to be explored. Certainly that might not need to go to a formalised human ethics board, but if the data is going to be used as part of an evaluation project at the organisational level, then the client needs to understand that. The person accessing treatment really needs to be involved and understand that process. The other key part comes to play is your own clinical judgment. So we know when people come for the first time to a service, the assessment process can be very overwhelming. There's lots of information that we're gathering and where there's lots that we're trying to understand in order to create an appropriate care plan, of course. And so it's about acknowledging the courage it's taken for people to reach out for support. It's about taking some time with that assessment process. So it might mean that you don't get through everything in that first session. And most importantly, it's that they leave that first interaction or that they are aware from that first interaction that they've actually got something that they were looking for. Have you checked in with them to ensure that it hasn't just been a fact-finding and data-gathering interaction, that they've actually been provided some information, that they feel a little more comfortable with you, and they've been given lots of opportunity to ask questions about the treatment process, the data capture that's happening right now, and what it's going to be used for. And so that's why it's so critical as a clinician, as someone who's working in the drug and alcohol sector, to really be engaged with data collection, to see the role and the point of it. And if you're in a leadership position, it's helping your crew, your team, to really understand how this can inform the therapy, improve the work that you're doing, ensure that the treatment is person-centered, and to respond should any particular red flags appear. Similarly, it's around that paying attention to how the person's responding to the questions you're asking, taking it at a nice pace, checking in regularly to see that they're okay and how they're finding this experience. Certainly in terms of going through the different outcomes measures, it might be to flag with them that there are some very sensitive questions, giving them some space and time to digest that. And really, I suppose, having up your sleeve the types of responses you may need in accordance with what they may say. For example, you may be asking some very specific things around mental health, distress symptoms, for example, and what will you do if you are concerned? If they do reveal perhaps that they are feeling suicidal, for example, do you have that knowledge and skills and particular pathways that you may engage with in order to ensure that person is, most importantly, safe in this exchange? You also want to be really attentive to your own responses and your own reactions. If you engage with the data collection and are able to really explain to a person how it will inform the treatment and make it the best experience that it can be, then you will find they too will engage with this process. If, on the other hand, you feel that it's a pointless exercise, that it's an administrative burden, that it really doesn't do anything to assist you in terms of the treatment you provide, then they too will disengage from that process. So a lot of the cues will come from you. So that's where you've got to really take the opportunity where you can, and to really start to see how these questions, as routine as they are, can really help you to understand the way in which the person is interacting with the treatment that's being provided. And so let's turn now to administering the COMS and hear from a couple of people with lived experience about what they think about asking these kinds of questions.
I am fine with being asked sensitive questions. That is, after all, what a support worker or a clinician is there to do. We're there to talk about sensitive topics. It's not easy, but it's core to what has to happen in those relationships. But it is the way it's asked and the time, just a little bit of time.
I think just being more aware that this person may have never talked about this issue. A worker talks about it all day and has heard it all, but for a client, it's the first time maybe stepping inside of a room and talking about it or being asked that sort of a question, especially with sensitive topics like abuse and rape and stuff like that. It's quite triggering for people.
First, I want a basis of trust, and rapport with that person. I want to know why they want that information, where it's going to be, what's the benefit for me and others in giving this information. I don't want to be judged by what comes out of my mouth. So it's a range of things, and it's also about being in a comfortable setting, in a confidential setting. And these things are important. You don't want the receptionist coming past and hearing what you're saying, for instance. And these things are really important in rural areas in particular, where we've got lack of services, a lot of people know each other, so accessing a service can even just accessing can mean that everyone in that community knows about it. Respect, and how you display that respect is by not reacting. If I'm going to be asked a sensitive question, I want to know beforehand that this question, you might find it sensitive, but the reason I'm asking is because whatever that is. And not reacting, reacting, there's a look that comes with it. And it's that look of, they don't really understand or want to understand how you're responding. So it's important, to remain professional.
Hopefully, that's given you a couple of insights into the way in which people themselves, so those that are accessing treatment, do feel and can be very engaged and see the relevance and importance of asking these questions. Let's turn now to each of the measures in NADAbase in turn. So when we're talking about drug and alcohol use, we've got two parts to this particular domain. The first is the severity of dependence scale, and that's a very brief 5-item screening measure and really hones in on the psychological aspects of dependence. It's quite easy to administer to evaluate the level of severity of substance dependence perceived by the client, and usually, and there are some tweaks and different research according to different drugs, but any score above 5 is usually considered dependent. And so the questions, as you may or may not be familiar with, ask very specifically about people's thoughts and feelings about their use. Now, one of the things that often gets raised is if you're in a residential facility and it's an abstinence-based program, some of the questions ask about people's thoughts and feelings about how distressed they may feel not being able to access a drug, or how much they worry about stopping using, for example. Now, for some people, that can be a bit of a challenge because they say, well, that person's not using the drug. So how can I ask this question and how can I make it relevant? But what this particular scale is really trying to hone in on is the thoughts and feelings around the use. And so while someone may not be still using the drug, they may still be very preoccupied with thinking about the drug, thinking about the role that it plays in their life, experiencing cravings, etc. And so when administering this particular aspect of the COMS, you're really asking them to think broadly about their thoughts and feelings, specifically about their drug use. And that's where you can really start to get to the heart of their experience. And what you may tend to see, particularly perhaps people coming into residential treatment, is they may enter treatment with a particular score, and it may indeed get worse as the person moves through treatment, as they are experiencing a longer and longer period of time away from the particular substance they're using, and then over time start to become more confident about that. And so once again, these measures are not intended to be asked and then forgotten about. These are intended for you to explore with your client so that when you come for that follow-up questioning, they'll be familiar with the survey questions themselves. You'll let them know why you're asking them again, why that matters, what's that's about. And then you're then better able to help them to answer as honestly as they can where they are in terms of their thoughts and feelings around their substance use. You can then be providing that data back to them and asking them, what do they think about these responses? How do they think they're going? And what does the outcomes measures say about how they might be going? The other element, obviously, around drug and alcohol use specifically in terms of the COMS measures are those specific questions around frequency of use. How much have you used in the last 4 weeks, for example? It's really important, particularly at that assessment time, so that first intake using those tools, to look at using, say, the follow back method, which is really helping someone, say, look at a calendar to think about where they were, what they were doing. Because if you're like me, you can barely remember what happened yesterday, let alone 4 weeks ago. So you really need to hold someone by the hand and take them through that process. In terms of psychological health, as we mentioned before, it's a Kessler 10+. And so why that was selected is that it's regularly used. You may be aware that it's used in particular in a GP setting to formulate a mental health plan and a referral to some clinical intervention. And so it's looking very specifically at person's anxiety and depression experiences in the past 4 weeks. Now, The difference with this particular measure is it has very specific cutoff scores, and it's banded in particular ways, and you can find more information about those bands on the NADAbase tutorial. But what it does tell us is that anywhere above a particular cutoff, we should actually be applying some other measures, particularly around suicidal ideation. And so not only does this measure provide you with an outcome, it certainly in that assessment phase and thereafter can alert you to where more intensive interventions may be needed. Because what we know is that you can ask someone how they're feeling and they may say to you, yeah, I'm fine. But when you utilize these very specific questions about how hopeless somebody feels, about how agitated or irritated or fidgety they feel, it's a lot more specific, and that's why it can be very, very useful, not just as an outcome measure, but also more importantly, to really understand how someone's going. Now, a lot of our members often share some alarm because someone's psychological distress may increase as they go into treatment. And that's very natural and very normal, because one of the things that we've done perhaps in terms of people cutting down or reducing or stopping their use is we've taken, for some people, away one of their most useful coping strategies. And so it's not unusual for people's psychological health to, or at least their distress around anxiety and depression, to escalate somewhat. You may see this particularly too with stimulant drugs. You know, for a long time, whilst those drugs may indeed have been causing harm, they may also have facilitated people's activeness or activity in their daily life. And so removing or reducing that use will have an impact on how motivated people feel, how active they are, or how engaged they are with their outside world. And so really it's taking people through these questions. It may also prompt you to revisit some questions, but it's taking it at a nice pace so that people understand why these questions are being asked and what can be put in place if indeed you and the person accessing treatment are particularly concerned about their psychological health. You know, it may indeed prompt some more thorough investigation by a psychiatrist, etc., that then supports and augments the treatment that's being provided. Without asking these questions and understanding where the person is, it makes it very difficult to effectively plan for treatment. And so don't be alarmed if you do see scales or responses escalate in the case of the K10. Obviously, the higher the score, the more the distress in this case. That will give you an opportunity to really revisit that with the client. Talk to them about what's happening for them right now and what is it you can do to support them best. In terms of health and social functioning, the WHO QOL-8 is an adaptation from the other WHO QOLs. And so one of the reasons why this measure is apart from being very widely used, it's really been used a lot in different cultural groups and been validated there. And you'll also notice if you do indeed use the ATOP that it there's some reflection there on one of the scales in the ATOP, which looks specifically at wellbeing. And so this particular domain attends to some of the physical health aspects. So really taking into account how someone going physically, their sort of overall perception of life, particularly around their social relationships and living environment, and you may notice too that there have been some additional questions taken from the Alcohol and Other Drug Treatment Services National Minimum Data Set, which are very specific around accommodation, which tells us something about the stability of someone's housing. And we know that all of these things together can give us a very useful picture about where someone is at. So for example, someone might be doing quite well in terms of their substance use. And when I say quite well, I mean reaching some of the goals they've set for themselves, but perhaps things are deteriorating at home or in relation to a particular relationship. And so what that tells us is that the person as a whole is needing some other different types of support. Now, the WHO QOL-8 is measured against itself. So what that means is that intake score or number at the very beginning is what you call the baseline, or the score to which the subsequent scores, so when you perhaps administer it again at 30 days or 60 days, is measured against. And so it becomes a very personal measure. There are no particular cutoffs or evaluations about what is a good or bad quality of life. But needless to say, the lower the scores, the less confident someone is about their overall quality of life. And so it's very important to start to look at how someone's going over time. And you will be able to specifically, once again, have some very clear areas to explore with the client around the ways in which you might support them. You'll also notice that there are some bloodborne virus risk questions that are quite important. And so these are added in order to really look at the risk that might be experienced by a client. So they may be doing well in all other areas, but perhaps, it prompts us to give them some more support around harm reduction strategies, for example, particularly too, if we are doing some follow-ups in the community. So perhaps they've been in some intensive treatment, they're now in some less intensive treatment, maybe people just checking in with them. And this is designed to really perhaps prompt us to ensure that they are aware of, other reduction strategies, such as, the availability of naloxone, or where they can get clean or sterile injecting equipment. And so the bloodborne virus risk questions really just help us, give us a sense of where someone's at in terms of their overall health. So as we think about this, we're really trying hard to bring the client outcomes measuring into the conversation. Try not to have it as something you do as an administrative task and forget about. So one way of doing that is to really bring it into the session. So if there's someone's been with you for a couple of months, perhaps as in an outpatient counselling setting, bring their data to your next session. Explore it with them. Ask them their opinion about where they feel things are going well and maybe not so well, so that you're able to tweak that treatment to really respond directly to that person. We know that if we collect all this data, enter it into a computer and never look at it, we're really doing our clients a disservice, because we took that time to ask them those questions. We really need to invest in them and bring them into the treatment session. It allows us to respond in real time to that person that's sitting in front of us, rather than looking at the data later on and saying, oh, gee, a lot of our clients have really got high levels of psychological distress. Maybe we should actually change two of the group settings to be more focused on some strategies to alleviate distress. Does that make sense? So you're really bringing it back to the therapy itself. Bring that data into case reviews and supervision, have a look at it, explore it, and really ask the clients what they think of the results. And then as a team, what is it telling you about the program or the body of work, the treatment that you're providing? Do there need to be some enhancements made? Would the service benefit from someone who's got a bit more mental health experience, for example? Certainly explore with people what ideas they have about improving their outcomes, but the outcomes perhaps of a treatment program. What will be most useful for them? And really trying to address those as you go along. And so in summary, I'd really like you to consider and think about how you currently collect your client outcomes or routine outcome measurement. How are you using it in the therapy? How do you explore it with your client? And then how do you bring that data into the therapy itself? I'd like now to invite you all to enter your questions into the Q&A box, letting us know what your thoughts are. What have some of the challenges been? How is it that we can help you more, really bringing that data to life? Because that's the one way that it will get easier and easier to thread it through into the treatment. We really owe it to our clients and any person that reaches out for support to adapt and modify and respond to their needs. And one of the key ways we can do that is through the collection of outcomes measurements. And most importantly, that we clearly demonstrate to our clients how we're going to use that data, why it's important, and the ways in which it's going to, in real time, respond and shift and change and support them in the ways that are best for them. So please put forward your questions. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget, we've got another webinar coming up in a couple of weeks that specifically looks at the data outcomes themselves. So it explores some of the features that are available to you in NADAbase, but also more importantly, some of the work that we're doing to really look at benchmarking and how we can use these outcomes measures to the best of our ability. I hope that's been helpful, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much for your participation today. We do have a couple of questions, and I'd like to turn to those now. The first question that's come through is around how we might engage clients who perhaps are feeling or appear to be quite agitated during the outcomes collection. So perhaps we've been talking to them, we've been asking some of the questions, we provided some good background, but maybe, yeah, you know, and the question is really around, can we leave the survey incomplete? So I suppose my response to this question is that what's paramount is that client's comfort. So we need to be doing everything we can to ensure they feel safe and comfortable. And so with that in mind, what I have found in my experience, and certainly from feedback from other clinicians, is that what's imperative is that we have laid some of the foundations for why we're collecting the information that we are, so that they understand why, what its purpose is and what it might be used for. That can help alleviate some potential agitation. But however, it's really responding to where that client's at. It's continually checking in with them. And if they do appear agitated, it's about saying to them that perhaps this is something that we can return to. How are they going? Would they like to take a bit of a break, perhaps? Certainly these outcomes measures, they can be returned to. It is helpful, obviously, where it's possible to complete the data collection itself. But certainly I would be always prioritising the comfort of the client or the person who's accessing your treatment service over the data collection itself. But what I would say is that the more you can build some comfort and safety and rapport and let them know why you're asking those questions in the first place, that can often alleviate some of that potential agitation or distress. Another question we have here is around how we might, as an organisation, invite clinicians to think of the client outcome measures as more than just a data collection tool. And I think the key things here are really specifically around how you bring the data into the conversation. Excuse me. So I think one of the things might be that if you do indeed have any consumers involved in your service, which we hope that you do, and if you need some support with that, our own Liz Gal can certainly help you in that area. Perhaps it's also about inviting them to have a look at the way in which you're asking the questions, to think about how they might support the process by being involved, so that people can start to see the value of these outcomes measures. Certainly too, I think if you are able to share them, and this is a real priority, if you can share them with the client themselves and show them that data and what it means and how you look at it, that is extremely powerful. And we've heard anecdotally of members sharing their outcomes data with their clients or the people accessing their services, and people printing things off, putting them up in their rooms if they're in residential treatment, or taking them home to their families. It really needs to be serving both the client and yourself as a conversational tool. And so wherever you can, it's weaving it into the service, weaving it into the therapy that will assist in sort of the workforce also seeing it of value. The other thing to do is to try to use opportunities such as meetings or conferences to actually share the results of your outcomes data. Certainly the fact that we now have 10 years worth of NADAbase data, we start to see a lot of engagement there. The building of dashboards, the provision of the data back to the people for whom it's about and who collect it, has been a really integral part of getting that buy-in and engagement. Another question I have here is, can we answer select surveys at certain time points instead of going through the gamut of questions every time? It sometimes takes most of their session and we weren't able to talk about why they're at the session to begin with. That's a really good question. We do need to balance, particularly if it's an outpatient hour or 50-minute counselling session, we do need to balance the data collection with the therapeutic work and ensuring the person gets something out of the session. What you will find is that the comms questions are relatively brief, and once you get into a bit of a flow with asking them, you'll appreciate that they get a little bit easier and a little bit quicker. However, what I would also say is that some of the questions open up opportunities for therapeutic talk. So what I mean by that is that try not to try and get all the data gathering out of the way and then move on into the therapeutic practice, but rather weave it into the therapeutic practice. So asking questions, prefacing that they might be sensitive, but they're going to sort of examine in a bit more detail someone's thoughts and feelings about their drug use, can really open up a conversation and be really helpful to the person that you're sitting with to explore it in a way that perhaps they haven't before. So you do need to ask each question as it's been provided in order for it to be valid. And certainly it does make sense to do it at a relatively regular time point. And another thing you might consider doing is on those occasions when you are going to be asking the questions, particularly say not just at intake, but say that 30-day follow-up, perhaps if you're in a community-based setting, you might consider extending that session somewhat just to enable that data collection to happen whilst you're weaving it into the therapy and then following it up in terms of what it might mean for the treatment itself, and also the care planning that you'll be doing with the person as well. Now, we don't have any other questions, but please shoot them through if you do have any others. What's really key is that there's a number of really good resources that are available to you specifically around asking questions and client outcomes. You'll find on the NADA website access to a range of tutorials that both have video footage as well as some written information, and they go through every single question that's contained in the NADAbase data set. And so if you're new to the service or new to the sector, you might want to explore those, and you can access them really easily via the NADAbase web platform through the little question icons that you'll see dotted throughout the actual database itself. You simply click on those and it will take you through to the tutorial section and it will identify specific points that you can explore as you go along. The other thing to keep in mind is that there's also the NADAbase support email. So if you have any particular queries or questions that you want to ask as you're going through, you can certainly use that function as well. And just in closing, I can't see any other further questions, but really reach out to us. We're here to support you. Next week's session will be focusing more on the data itself and how you can use that in creative ways, and certainly to look at the way in which it can inform not only individual practice treatment, but also the types of things you might want to look at an organisational level. I hope it's been really helpful for you today. We really thank you for joining us, and please do reach out if there's anything that we can do to help. Thanks for your time.